We are going to start a new Heschel essay this evening together. We are going to start his speech that he delivered at the Conference on Religion and Race in January of 1963. That speech is going to incorporate into it many of the elements from the essay on the prophets that you'll remember while it was published in the 1960s as a book for wide consumption is actually based on his doctoral work back in the 1930s. So these are ideas that he has been percolating on for 3 decades before delivering this speech, which is really a summation of his understanding of the prophetic call to justice as it pertained to the burgeoning American civil rights movement in 1963, and contains a lot of the themes in it that Heschel found in his earlier writings and would continue to build on through the rest of his life, through the 1960s and into the early 1970s before his death. This is the speech that introduced Heschel to Dr. King. He met Dr. King at this conference, and the two of them became close friends and confidants. It would be Heschel who would ultimately convince Dr. King to break his silence on the Vietnam War and to come out and give a powerful speech at the Riverside Church in New York, despite some of his lieutenants fearing that that would distract from the issue of civil rights. It was at the Heschels that Dr. King would spend Passover. And if I could be anywhere in history, you know, that wonderful mixer question, if you could be in any room in history, what room would you like to be in? At Passover Seder with the Heschels and the Kings would be way up there at the top of the list. Can you imagine sitting with those two families talking about what it is to come out of Egypt? And so we're going to look through his speech together and pause to talk about it as we go. Let me share screen. Here we go. I also sent out a link to the speech. Hopefully everybody got that if it's easier to follow along on your own. It's also printed in this wonderful volume, The Insecurity of Freedom, which is a collection of many of Heschel's classic essays. And this is the one that I have all highlighted up. So I'll be going back and forth between the screen and the book. For anybody who is just joining us, we are turning our attention to Abraham Joshua Heschel's speech in January of 1963 at the National Conference on Religion and Race, the conference that introduced Heschel and King, and a speech that builds on the themes that we saw explored in his essay on the prophets. And the first time we're seeing him not just describing the prophets of old, but beginning to embody an element of that prophetic consciousness, that supreme sensitivity to evil, that high set of moral standards, that God's eye view on humanity that he describes. At the first conference on religion and race, the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. What a wonderful way to begin. Moses' words were, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go that they may celebrate a feast to me." While Pharaoh retorted, "Who is the Lord that I should heed this voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." The outcome of that summit meeting has not come to an end. Pharaoh is not ready to capitulate. The Exodus began, but it's far from having been completed. In fact, it was easier for the children of Israel to cross the Red Sea than for a Negro to cross certain university campuses. Heschel is starting the speech by taking us back to what he calls the first conference on religion and race, the confrontation between Moshe and Pharaoh. Now, different ones of us on the screen are differently immersed in the Passover story. Some people have been marking and retelling this Passover story for 90 plus years. Hi, Bubby and Zadie. Some people are newer comers to this story, but this is the foundational Jewish story. There is something about Passover and its narrative that compels a degree of Jewish attention unlike any other story. In the last big study of American Jews in 2013 by the Pew Center, it was found that while 1 in 10 American Jews are weekly synagogue goers, and only 1 in 4 American Jews are weekly Shabbat observers in any way, and a scant majority will fast on Yom Kippur, about 3/4 of American Jews say that they participate in a Passover Seder every year. Far and away the highest level of participation of any Jewish ritual. And that means that this story of the confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh and the call to let my people go is the best known Jewish story, because it's the story that we come back to over and over again at the Seder table. And it's a story which is not just well known among Jews, but really is the foundational liberation story in Western culture. This is a story that many different peoples have used at different times to describe their struggle for liberation. One of the books I come back to most often is a book by a scholar named Michael Walzer. It's called Exodus and Revolution. Michael Walzer is a professor of international relations at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Studies, which is where Einstein had his tenure, so a pretty serious place. Michael Walzer primarily writes on international relations and specifically on the question of when is war justifiable. He is a Jewish scholar, but not a scholar of Judaism. But he wrote this book, Exodus and Revolution, in 1985, based on a personal experience with the Exodus story and the civil rights movement. And the story goes that Walzer, a Jewish kid from New Jersey, went, as many Jewish kids from the Northeast did in the early 1960s, to register Black folks to vote in the Deep South. This was dangerous work. This was work that could get you harassed and thrown in jail. And this was work that could get you killed, as 2 Jewish kids from the Northeast were killed by the Klan, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, along with James Chaney, during this same summer that Walzer was volunteering in Alabama. Walzer describes from his experience having gone to a Black church and heard the pastor preaching a sermon on the Exodus as a way of talking about the struggle for civil rights, and having a certain curious awakening. Having an awakening to realize that this story, which he had only ever encountered in a Jewish context around a Seder table, wasn't a story wholly owned by the Jews. That this was a story that many peoples told to themselves and about themselves as a way of describing and framing their struggles against the particular pharaohs of their age. And it set him on a lifelong intellectual quest to understand the ways that the Exodus story gets utilized by different cultures at different times. And that's what this book is about. This book is about the way in which American colonists described King George in pharaoh terms. It's about the way in which Black slaves in the South in the 19th century sang songs in which they described their white masters as pharaohs and themselves as the children of Israel. I, embarrassingly, got to college before I realized that the song Go Down Moses that we sang at my Passover Seder table growing up wasn't written by Jews. I didn't know that. I thought it was our song. I didn't realize that it was being sung by Black slaves who had a tangible lived experience of what it was to be in bondage and to hope with their whole hearts for the coming of a Moses who would tell the pharaohs to let the people go. This Exodus imagery gets evoked in the American Civil Rights Movement. It gets evoked in Latin American liberation theology. It gets evoked in many, many different places. It becomes, Walzer demonstrates in the book, a paradigmatic story that can be used in many times and places to describe a struggle for liberation. And Heschel chooses to begin his speech at the 63 Conference on Religion and Race by saying, we are part of a debate that has gone on since time immemorial, a debate that goes back to this paradigmatic story in the Western spiritual tradition, a confrontation between oppressor and oppressed, a confrontation between that which would hold a certain group back because of their identity and the claim of a just God who would say that no man deserves to live under the bondage of another. And so Heschel starts his essay by invoking Moses and Pharaoh and places himself in the long and ongoing tradition of those who will use this Passover narrative that we're about to retell and celebrate as a way of framing this universal and timeless struggle for human liberation. Come back to the essay. As he says, the outcome of the summit meeting has not yet come to an end. This is a story that didn't take place long, long ago. This is a story that takes place now and always. And we symbolize that, of course, in the Passover Seder with the most famous and important line in the Haggadah, B'kol dor v'dor hayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. In each and every generation, a person is obligated to see themselves as having personally come out of Egypt, that this isn't a story that happened to them. This is a story that we are meant to personalize and to experience as though it happened to us. The story is about a time and place in antiquity, but it is equally the story of everybody who sits down at the Seder table or who retells the story in pursuit of their own liberation. Let us dodge no issues. Back to the essay. Let us yield no inch to bigotry. Let us make no compromise with callousness. In the words of William Lloyd Garrison, famous abolitionist, I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, that is slavery, I do not wish to think, to speak, or to write with moderation. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. Religion and race. How can the two be uttered together? To act in the spirit of religion is to unite that which lies apart, to remember that humanity as a whole is God's beloved child. To act in the spirit of race is to sunder, to slash, to dismember the flesh of living humanity. Is this the way to honor a father, to torture his child? How can we hear the word race and feel no self-reproach? Racism as a normative legal or political concept is capable of expanding to formidable dimensions. A mere thought, it extends to become a way of thinking, a highway of insolence, as well as a standard of values overriding truth, justice, and beauty. As a standard of values and behavior, race operates as a comprehensive doctrine, as racism, and racism is worse than idolatry. Racism is Satanism, unmitigated evil. I want to stop here, and I want to call back to what we read from the prophets, in which Heschel says the prophet is the man who is incapable of moderation. The prophet is an extremist. The prophet is not interested in compromise and half measures. The prophet says what the prophet is going to say, despite and damn whatever anybody thinks about it. And for that reason, the prophet is reviled and rejected and sometimes threatened and sometimes killed. But the prophet is not willing to operate by half measures. Here, Heschel evokes Garrison, the radical abolitionist publisher, who says, I'm not interested in compromise. I'm not interested in half measure. I am interested in speaking truth. This is wrong. Slavery is wrong. No but at the end of the sentence. And Heschel goes on to say, racism is not a mild evil with which we can coexist, a problem to be gradually worked on and overcome. Racism is, for him, a Satanism, a worship of that which is opposed to all that is good. And so it can't be met with half measures. It has to be met with a furious and immoderate response, a persistent pushback, an uncompromising rejection. I ask us to think a little bit about this theme from the prophets and from this first part of the Heschel essay, and to get some of your thoughts about how you know with what you can compromise and with what you can't. How do you know when gradualism is the right approach? You can't eat the elephant, you can't drink the ocean, you have to do the little bits that you can to move the needle the little bit that you can. And when is gradualism a way of not acknowledging the depths of a problem and not committing oneself as fully as needs be to its opposition? How do you know when the right move is to do things moderately and gradually and seek compromise? And how do you know when the right thing is to just fight like hell? I want to put you into chats to talk about that a little bit. I think that's a good conversation for small groups. I'm going to open up the small groups now and invite you to go have a good conversation. How do you know when to be gradual and compromising in pursuit of the right? When do you reject that kind of gradualism and compromise and just say, there is good and there is bad? Go for it. Come back from what I trust were interesting conversations. I do want to open it up and hear some of your thoughts, but I want to read just a little bit more, and then turn back to the question you were discussing in breakout. Looking at the screen, perhaps this conference should have been called Religion or Race. You cannot worship God and at the same time look at man as if he were a horse. Shortly before he died, Moses spoke to his people. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life. This is part of Moses's final speech in Deuteronomy. The aim of this conference is first of all to state clearly the stark alternative. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. I have set before you religion and race, life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life. Heschel is saying there are certain stark and binary choices in life. Life or death, blessing or curse. And here he is arguing that there is no way to hold both religion, which teaches that all of us are the children of God, and racism, which teaches that some of us are more favored children than others. They are simply incompatible to be held together. No compromise, no middle ground, no, well, you can sort of figure out a way. So what did you talk about in your breakouts? How do you know when the right thing to do is to take that kind of a firm, either or binary right and wrong kind of stance? And how do you know when the right thing to do is to seek the wisdom of multiple perspectives and to move forward an agenda through compromise and gradualism? I imagine we probably have some different ideas shared among the 31 screens here, and that's okay and good. What did what are your thoughts? Yes, Mitchell.
Okay. I raised my hand. There you go. I would say in our room at the very end, unfortunately, I dominated a little bit too much, and I apologize for that. I didn't think we'd only have 5 minutes. Um, but at the end, someone said it may be impossible to know the answer to that question because, number one, the degree to which you confront a number of issues, depending on what those issues are, and we can talk about modern day issues. Race was always is maybe not quite as a modern day issue as it was, whether it be the Israel Palestinian issue, whether it be gender issues. There are often times that being able to discuss those issues, taking a hard stance on it, breaks down a communication rather than fostering a communication. And when you break down a communication, then it becomes an action. And the question then on the action may be, is it a action like in the issues of the 60s it was done nonviolently, or does the action become violent? Do you have a right to take action to correct a wrong with violence? That question we never got to.
Hmm. So to summarize, when a harsh line in the sand is drawn, the question is first, does it help to advance the cause? Is the cause best advanced by a more gradualist approach, or does drawing a line and saying right and wrong, black and white, create a shutdown and antagonism? And second, by what means is one allowed to oppose an absolute wrong? Okay, we can name an absolute wrong. We can say racism is an absolute wrong. Is one allowed to oppose it by any means necessary, up to and including by violent means? That's a secondary question when you're talking in a world of moral absolutes, because there is a part of the logic of moral absolutism that says if something is absolutely wrong, it is to be opposed by whatever means can best defeat it, and perhaps those means might even become by violent means. There are some times when we need to oppose something violently, maybe. Interesting. Thank you, Mitchell. Eileen and Mitch, and then Ruth next.
Yes, I was the one speaking at the end of the rooms. And what I was saying is I don't think that you can really decide to which issues are worthy of gradualism and which are worthy of absolutism. I think that this issue, racism, is a bad issue from which to draw any conclusions, because this one's really binary, but it may be the exception. I think there are far more issues that are either nuanced or have reasonable points of view. We were talking a few weeks ago, protesting against Darfur, good. Protesting BDS, well, that depends who you are. It depends on your conscience. That's what we were talking about. So there are a lot of issues that are a matter of conscience. And once you get to that, you're going to need to have a discussion. On race, this is probably one of the binary issues. But then you get to what extent are we willing to be binary about it? And you ask the question, up until violence or beyond violence. I don't think that we can really be absolutist about anything, even racism, although this one is almost truly binary. But I think most issues aren't, and I don't think we can draw conclusions from racism into other issues because they're generally not as binary as this one.
Interesting. And I think to some extent, Mitch, that is an answer to the question posed, which is, how do you know when there's an issue which is truly deserving of a binary? There is right and there is wrong. You said this is an issue where that seems to be as close to the possible as you could imagine. But there are going to be other issues where gradualism is the more appropriate response, or pluralism is the more appropriate response. The question here is a question of discernment. How do you discern what are the things about which one says, no, there is a right and a wrong here? And how do you discern which of the things which it is important to be nuanced about? I think you're underlining exactly that moral question, which is very, very important. You can't be black and white about everything. If you're black and white about everything, you have failed to take some significant things into account. If you can't be absolute about something, it is wrong to murder 6 million Jews. It is wrong to keep people in a permanent state of disenfranchisement and poverty. It is wrong to fill in the blank. If you can't say that, you've lost, I mean, you've lost everything. So it is a question of discernment. How do you know? And it's a really, really good one. It's a tough one. We'll go to Tanya and then Ruth.
I just wanted to second that aspect of discernment, and also actually of style and of sort of the I don't know, sort of the whatever is sort of in vogue in a particular era. And the story I have to tell is this: I was born in South Africa, and my grandfather, after we moved to the States, we'd have these conversations on the phone, and I always thought that his use of language was not terribly politic. You know, I thought that he used language in a way, and I thought it just like reflected the apartheid state in which we had left. But if you actually would hear stories about what the things that my grandfather did, what he did was exactly opposite to what I was hearing. You know, like he had clients who nobody else would take on as an attorney. He made sure that anybody who worked for the family had money of it, that was sent to them after they stopped working for the family. Basically, he provided a retirement, like a private retirement for people who had worked in the house. And so I think in today's modern era, he would have been labeled a racist based on his language. But based on his actions, I think he would have been judged very differently. And I think part of the difficulty, I think, in making these black and white judgments is how we do discern what somebody's doing. And it's not always as easy or black and white, I guess I could joke, as it may seem on the surface.
Thank you. So maybe there's something about getting very clear on what is the sin, right? What is the thing that we are labeling, and what is it not? When we say that racism is something to be utterly opposed and condemned, to what extent, knowing that all of us carry implicit biases, none of us are exempt from some degree of stereotypical thinking, to what extent do we see all forms of that sort of thinking in exactly the same light? One of the challenges in contemporary politics, it seems to me, has been a way in which we have trouble giving moral weight to certain things over others, in which we see all things as kind of painted with one equal brush. That's a challenge. That's a challenge, right? It was a very live challenge. For example, I don't want to go too far down this road, but I know that I'm bringing up a very freighted and personally meaningful example for people. But one of the challenges at the height of Me Too was the challenge of whether a joke or a pass and a rape are the same. Not to say that all of them aren't unacceptable, but to say, can we make distinctions between different levels of unacceptable? And one of the challenges of that movement was a perception by many people that it failed to do that it blanketed every level of transgression and treated them with equal moral weighting. That's a big question. How do we, when we're making those moral discernments, how are we sure that we are making moral discernments on the thing we're actually talking about and not expanding it beyond the beyond the original scope. Thank you. Ruth, please.
Two things from what I'm listening to is that just because something is kind of black and white and, in these words, evil, or doesn't mean that your response should be violence or, to that point. Like that's a response that's also evil, you want to make sure that you're responding in such a way that if you've made a mistake or, like, I think the response is different than the discernment. And the discernment, personally, and I, think about this a lot, is that I can see things that are most certainly wrong, and I want to do something about it, but I'm actually, frankly, afraid to do something about it. So, what the personal consequences could be to me or my family or whatever, so I don't have as much trouble discerning something that's really terribly wrong. I just don't know what to do.
I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads. Yeah, thank you, Ruth. Thank you for sharing that. Alex, please.
Yeah, I was wondering if isn't there a teaching in the Talmud that every sin is permissible to save a life except for a certain list, which include harming another, or killing another, raping another, or what else is on that list, Rabbi?
Yeah, so the rabbis in the Talmud say one is permitted to violate a law in order to save a life, except for in three cases. In three cases, the first being murder, the second being sexual assault, and the third being a sort of public desecration of God's name. And so those are the three things for which one is supposed to choose death for themselves, in which martyrdom is the appropriate response, rather than if I say, I'm going to shoot you unless you shoot him, you're not supposed to shoot him, you're supposed to accept your own death. And there are other things which can be set aside in emergency circumstances, but they can't be set aside at the cost of somebody else's life, dignity, or the public reputation of the moral system.
Maybe that's the key to finding what can be compromised with, what can't be compromised with.
Yeah. And the more we talk about this, the more it seems that the morality of any system is dependent on being able to decide what is worth it and what is not. If you think everything can be compromised, there's no absolutes, you have lost your moral center. If you believe everything is an absolute and there can be no compromise, you have lost your moral center. And the proper role, perhaps, of a wisdom tradition, Judaism is a wisdom tradition, among many others, is to help us do that challenging work of figuring out what are those things on which the proper response is to be flexible, and what are those things on which the proper response to be inflexible. And coming to that clarity is bedrock to morality. And it's not easy. It's not easy. I don't think Heschel is claiming that it's easy. I think Heschel is saying on this issue of this day, we need to be prepared to say wrong. And that makes this issue special and unique and important. But it doesn't apply then generally that one needs to say that about every possible thing. One doesn't need to look at, somebody eating bacon for breakfast and point a finger and say that your bacon is Satanism, right? Please, Goldman's.
I'm going to ask a question. I think, just to be clear, you're not allowed to murder an innocent person in defense of a life. But this is not to say self-defense is impermissible. You're not allowed to take a third person's life. But the problem is once you go down the path of violence, anybody can feel threatened. Anybody can justify their violence as self-defense. this is a big problem we have now. Silence is violence, violence is silence. There doesn't seem to be a distinction anymore, and people are threatened about the smallest of things, and then they can justify the most extreme violence because of that threat. So I think the only prohibition is murdering an innocent person who's not involved in the conflict. But those are that I think I'm right about that. Is that one of those three things? It's not a self-defense issue.
It's absolutely not a self-defense issue. Jewish law is very clear on a distinction between murder and killing. Killing is not a priori against Jewish law. There are situations in which there is a time to kill. One of those situations being if you are under threat from somebody who's coming to kill you. The Talmud says, if someone is coming to kill you, get up early in the morning and kill them first. This is not a pacifistic tradition. And it's not a tradition that sanctions unnecessary brutality. It's the same dynamic we've been talking about, right? It's a question of discernment. The extreme of it is never appropriate to use violence ever means that evil can go unopposed and run rampant. The other side being, let's use violence with no concern for its consequence. We become the evil that we oppose. There has to be discernment in both sides, and an absolutist position on either, or a failure to discern when is the time for one and when is the time for the other, becomes then our undoing. Yeah, let's go back to Heschel for just a few more moments. Thank you for a really, really enlightening conversation. What is an idol? This is a good question. What is an idol? Any God who is mine but not yours. Any God concerned with me but not with you is an idol. Faith in God is not simply an afterlife insurance policy. Racial or religious bigotry must be recognized for what it is, a Satanism, a blasphemy. In several ways, man is set apart from all created in 6 days. The Bible does not say God created the plant or the animal. It says God created different kinds of plants, different kinds of animals. In striking contrast, it does not say God created different kinds of men of different colors and races. It proclaims God created one single man, and from one single man, all men are descended. To think of man in terms of white, black, or yellow is more than an error. It is an eye disease, a cancer of the soul. Let's talk about idolatry. And specifically, this claim that Heschel is making that religion and racism are in direct opposition to one another. We would understand, anybody who reads the Bible would understand, that idolatry and religion are in direct competition with each other. When God gives the 10 Commandments, God introduces God's self and immediately says, here's the first thing you need to know: have no idols, worship no one else but me. We would think that the binary would be religion or idolatry. Here, Heschel is saying racism is in a similar binary relationship with religion because racism is an idolatry. Racism is an idolatry. And why is racism an idolatry? Because it posits a God which is small. Idol worship, ultimately, is a claim that God is small. God can fit inside of a statue. God can fit inside of one religion. God is small enough that God can love me and not anybody else. And to constrain God that way, to make God that small, that narrow, that parochial, is to reject, Heschel would say, the transcendent nature of God. God who is always bigger than, these narrow human distinctions. And so racism becomes for Heschel a form of idolatry because it posits a certain kind of God who is only concerned with some and not with others. I wonder how you react to that idea of a fundamental incompatibility between religion and racism. Certainly, history has said that one can claim religiosity and also be a blatant racist. In fact, one can claim religion and use it as the justification for a racial ideology. To say, this is the order that God created, and God created me as the higher and the rightful masters of the world. Heschel says such thinking is delusional and represents a sort of narcissistic corruption of religion. I wonder what your reactions to that idea of an incompatibility between religion and racism, or racism as a form of idolatry, which is, by the way, one of those three things about which we are supposed to die rather than violate: murder, rape, and idol worship, public desecration. Or thinking, processing. That's good. Yeah, Jill, please.
So is that speaking to how historically religion been used for the the whatever the my gosh, no words, the crusades, and the where religion is used to put other people down, or maybe to or when it was used to uh try and convert people from whatever their natural religion was. Mine is right and yours is wrong, right?
Yeah. So there is a natural tendency in religion which makes a claim to teach you something true about the world, to see one's own truth as the only possible truth, and the one who holds the truth as needing to communicate that truth to other people. And if they accept it, all is well and good. And if they reject it, they have rejected truth. They have turned away from God. They are damned and should be either ignored, persecuted, or killed. That is the sickness that exists, always lingering at the edges of any organized group. Any organized group that makes a truth claim in the world has the potential to turn that truth claim into a claim of supremacy. I know something, therefore I am right, therefore you are wrong, therefore I need to either convert you or you need to suffer. Right? That's the risk. It's the risk in making nations. It's the risk in making religions. And one might say it's the test. It's a test that people have failed repeatedly in history. People have formed these groups and failed the test, and allowed those group identities to become excuses for the destruction of others. Heschel is saying, ultimately, that is a perversion of religion. It's a perversion of religion. It's, in fact, an idol worship. It's bad religion to see one group as superior to another group, because at the core of at least the Jewish truth claim is the idea that we all come from one source. And if we all come from one source, then we have a fundamental equality and a shared dignity. And to say one is religious and to act as though we don't all come from one source is to expose that one doesn't actually understand or believe the core Jewish truth claim. So, yeah, religion is justifiably criticized for dividing the world into us and them. That's a fair criticism of religion. We've got a long history of it. And Heschel would say, that's the kind of religion that we're being warned against in the commandment not to worship idols. Yeah. Alex, then Howard.
Yeah, I just want to reemphasize the point you made. And anti-racism is as a truth claim is as far as Heschel and as far as I feel is based on on acceptance of the basic truth of Breshit, the basic truth of Genesis. We all started with one couple as ancestors, and without that faith claim, that leaves open the door to racism. I want to point out that the abolitionist movement started off as a religious movement among Quakers in England, and continued largely as a religious movement here in the United States. That even the what was King's group was a Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That in the case against forcible sterilization of people who've been judged with subnormal intelligence, the case of Carrie Buck, her only champions were fundamentalists, and one of the emotional drivers in creationism and anti-evolutionism is the possibility. It is just rejecting the possibility that there may be, separate evolutions for the different types of human beings. So it's complicated, and it's ironic.
Religion has been at the forefront of some of the movements to tear us apart. Religion has been at the forefront of some of the movements to bring us together. Anything this powerful has the potential to be wielded for good and for ill. And religion is many things. One thing it certainly is powerful. And with that great power comes the great responsibility, the great care to make sure we are wielding it for what we can best discern to be God's moral purpose in the world. And that's not simple, but we do have examples of heroes. The Quaker abolitionists like Garrison, the Southern pastors like King, Heschel. We have examples of people who do it. We've got plenty of counterexamples of people who use religion in very destructive ways. Yeah. Please, Howard, and then we'll bring it to a close.
I've always been puzzled by the white supremacy people, evangelicals, who constantly preach the Bible without giving thought to the fact that the people they're talking about in the Bible and worship were probably not as lily white as they are.
I mean, there is a long history in art history that my wife could speak to much more intelligently than I, of the lily white Jesus, who did not look a lot like the Middle Easterner that he was. Let me bring this to a close with thanks to everybody. Heschel is asking us to do hard moral work. He's asking us to take religion seriously, which means that we have to not encounter it passively. We have to, as people who claim to be inheritors of a moral wisdom tradition, do the work to figure out what are those things with which we cannot coexist. What are those things that we have to be able to condemn? And what are those things that we don't? And when we identify something that we need to condemn, in what way do we do it? How do we do it without becoming the thing that we condemn? How do we oppose evil without becoming part of the problem? That's real hard work. And one of the reasons that I have staked my life on wrestling with these books and these ideas is because I think it's a really worthy and difficult challenge. It's worth our time and care and attention to learn how to recognize what is wrong in the world, to think about how we oppose that which is wrong in the world, to think about how we can utilize this powerful human force, which is religion, how we can marshal it to its very best and highest possibilities, rather than allowing the weaknesses that are inherent in all of us to drag us into a place of self-satisfaction, arrogance, and supremacism. This is hard work, guys, and it is made easier by groups of smart, caring people who come together to talk through the issues and to ask the questions and figure it out. So I am nourished by this group each and every time we meet, and I hope that we leave not feeling that we have been fed a set of answers, but rather feeling like we have, through Heschel's words, been handed a set of challenging questions that we can then live into. I thank you for being part of this. I will let you know whether or not we'll be meeting next week. If we don't see each other before Pesach, I wish you a Chag Sameach, and I hope that you have the thought at some point at your Pesach Seder table that the story that we're telling is the first conference on religion and race, the first time these questions were brought to the fore, and the knowledge that that conference never finished. Those issues never got fully resolved. We have work in every generation to continue to advance the Moses agenda against the Pharaoh agenda. Thanks so much, everybody.